The place where all scholarship starts is definitions. If we don't start with clear definitions of our basic concepts, then we can never be sure that others understand what we're saying, and worse yet, we can never be sure that we understand ourselves. So, in our first lecture of the course, we'll begin by defining science and anthropology, the two most basic ideas in the course. This whole lecture will fall under the category of philosophy of science, a topic that far too many people, including scientists, neglect. Without a strong understanding of the philosophy of science, it is impossible to do science well. To start with, we need to understand what a formal definition is in the first place. A formal definition, the sort you'd find in a dictionary, does two things. First, it takes the thing you're trying to define and puts it in a larger category. X is a kind of Y. Second, the definition differentiates that thing from other members of the same category. So X is different from other kinds of Y because of Z. So I might define dog as the kind of four-legged animal that barks. It belongs to the larger category of four-legged animals, but it's the one that barks. It doesn't meow or moo. So to understand cultural anthropology, we must first know what category it belongs to and how it differs from other members of that same category. What I'll do then is start by trying to define very large categories of ideas, then subdivide them into smaller and more specific ideas until eventually we work our way down to the category of cultural anthropology. The largest category I'll start with is science. On page 12, the textbook defines science in a pretty standard way, a field of study that seeks reliable explanations with reference to the material and physical world. The potential problem here is that not all sciences are really about material phenomena. Our own field, for example, is more about ideas and relationships. So I'm going to offer a bit more philosophical definition of science. I think this definition does a better job of highlighting what's important about science for anthropologists. Science is a knowledge system that assumes an objective reality independent of any observer and investigates it via the scientific method. So the larger category that science belongs to is knowledge system, which is just a general term for any set of rules for determining whether a statement is true or false or something else. Other knowledge systems include mathematics, or religion, or tradition, or even intuition. Where science differs from other knowledge systems is the rest of the definition. Science assumes an objective reality independent of any observer. All knowledge systems make assumptions. In mathematics, those assumptions are called axioms. In religion, they're called articles of faith. Science makes the assumption that there is something to learn about. This means that in science you start by assuming that there's something out there, outside of yourself, and it is true or false whether you agree or not. Other knowledge systems are much more subjective. Whether an idea is true or not depends on who's asking. Well, if there is an objective reality, how do we learn about it? This is a second way that science differs. It uses the scientific method to investigate reality. Now, this might seem a little obvious, but what's important is the method itself. You can assume an objective reality without being scientific about how you investigate it. There are plenty of definitions of the scientific method, but this one covers the most important parts. The scientific method is a way of investigating the world by describing observations, then explaining those observations, testing those explanations with more observations, and revising them to be more accurate. The observations made in this process are called data. Explanations are called theories. The scientific method is an ongoing process. The last few steps of testing, followed by revision, followed by testing, followed by revision, and so on, form an endless loop with no exit point. At no point is an explanation considered proven in the absolute sense. All theories are open to change when new data is available, and science is never done. This, again, is very different from other knowledge systems like algebra, where once you complete the proof for a theorem, that theorem is true beyond any challenge for all time. All sciences use this method. For anthropology specifically, these observations and conclusions are about human culture. The goal is to understand and explain human culture. How does it vary? Why does it vary? What about it doesn't vary and why? And how does it change or stay the same over time? Again, the textbook explores how the scientific method works on pages 13 through 15. And while its explanation isn't incorrect, I think we can do a better job of highlighting exactly what it is that anthropologists are doing. This involves tweaking the definitions of some terms a bit. I'm coming at the issue from a slightly different philosophical perspective than Kotak. The most important step in the scientific method is the testing phase, and there are two terms that are really important to understanding that phase. These terms are hypothesis and theory. Your textbook author takes the approach that most of us, myself included, were taught in grade school science class. A hypothesis is a suggested but as yet unverified explanation, and a theory is a framework of logically connected ideas that helps us to explain not just one, but many associations. Those are both awfully vague, and they imply that hypotheses turn into theories, which is exactly the opposite of how science actually does progress. To see why, we need to go back and look at the scientific method in a slightly different, more technical way. In the first step of the scientific method, the scientist observes the world and notices certain changes. These are variables, things that are able to vary. And when you observe variables changing, you see that they change with one another. F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. Or, as temperature goes up, the height of mercury in a thermometer also goes up. These are associations. Associations among variables describe the observable world. So the first step in the scientific method is to describe associations among variables. That is, you collect data. But why does force equal mass times acceleration? Descriptions of that sort are completely scientific, accurate, and valuable, but they're not intellectually satisfying. We can describe all day, but what we really want to do is explain. That's the second step of the scientific method, and where a theory comes in. The textbook definition of a theory states that it is a set of ideas that help to explain, which is true. That explanation explains the associations of the variables. A theory, in my definition, explains observable relationships and variables, that is data, by proposing unobserved relationships and variables. That is, we try to explain what we do see by suggesting that there's more going on that we don't see, at least directly. Our senses only give us access to a small portion of that objective reality. Science is about learning what's going on in the part that we can't sense directly. So we infer what we don't see by looking at the behaviors of what we do see. Why does the mercury in a thermometer go up as temperature goes up? Well, the mercury appears to us as a single homogeneous silver liquid. But in reality, it's made up of these tiny, tiny things that we can't see called molecules. And they're always vibrating. As they get hot, they bump into each other and push one another apart, and the mercury now takes up more space than before, so it pushes up the glass tube. You can't see molecules, but you can see their effects on the mercury. Our knowledge of molecules doesn't come from our senses. It is constructed by the theory. So molecules are theoretical constructs, unobservable things that are proposed as ways of explaining observable data. In this course, the primary observed relationships will be the interactions of individuals within a community. The theoretical constructs that explain those relationships will include ideas like culture, power, or economy. You observe the interactions. You explain those traits with concepts. But those are abstract concepts that you can't see, feel, weigh, etc. But it's important to understand that just like molecules are real despite being unobservable, So are culture and economy real, despite being abstract? So that's step 2 of the scientific method. Now we want to test whether that theory is correct, to find a way to show that the theoretical constructs really do exist, even if we can't see them. But since they can't be measured directly, we can't just look for them. We need a hypothesis. In this approach, a hypothesis is an observable pattern that is the logical consequence of a theory. If the theory is true, then the hypothesized pattern will be observed. The if part is in the present tense because it describes how we believe the world to be. The then part is in the future tense because it describes how the variables will behave when we next gather data. So if molecules exist and vibrate, present tense, then as temperature drops, so will the mercury, future tense. If culture exists, present tense, then individuals will change their behavior over time, future tense. The important point here is that the then part of the hypothesis is actually observable. It predicts a pattern of variables that can be directly measured, seen, etc. To put it another way, a hypothesis is a prediction of what you'll find in the next round of data gathering. But that prediction is based on the theory. If the explanation you came up with in step 2 is true, then the pattern you predicted in step 3 appears. The hypothesis is the consequence of the theory, so you can't formulate the hypothesis until you have already formulated the theory. What comes first is the theory. The theory gives you the hypothesis. Step 3 of the scientific method is going out and looking for that hypothesized pattern. If you don't find it, the theory is false. That's why this stage is sometimes called falsification. It's easy to prove a theory false. You just fail to find the hypothesized patterns. On the other hand, if you do find the hypothesized pattern, the theory is not proven true. There could be many reasons for that pattern to appear, but at least the theory is more likely to be true now than it was before. You never prove a theory to be true, but you do fail to falsify it. And the more you fail to falsify, the more confident you can be that your theory is probably correct. Step 4 becomes revising the theory to explain the new observations, then generating a new hypothesis and going back to step 3. Most often, what scientists find with extremely complex theories like those used by anthropologists is that the theory is true in some ways and false in others. When that happens, we don't throw out the whole theory and start from scratch. Instead, we revise the parts that need revision and keep the parts that are consistent with the data, and we improve our explanations over time. The primary difference between my explanation and Kotak's is the relationship between the hypothesis and the theory. In Kotak's explanation, and in most general science textbooks, the hypothesis is simply a guess at the answer to a question, and the theory only comes later when the hypothesis is accepted as true and applied much more generally. While from a certain perspective that's not incorrect, I don't think it really describes what anthropologists and other scientists are actually doing. In my explanation, the theory comes first. We explain the observed relationship first with the theory, and then the theory is used to formulate the hypothesis, the prediction that we actually look for in the data. And that's the real sequence of thought. After a look at the recap 1.4 on page 15, why would you ever formulate that hypothesis on line 2 if you hadn't already formulated the theory on line 9? Thus far, everything we've discussed describes all kinds of science. All sciences use the scientific method, by definition, but they apply it in different ways to different parts of the world. Let's talk now about the different kinds of science as we work our way down to physical anthropology. The one most people probably learned in grade school is the distinction between the physical sciences and the social sciences. This distinction is based on what parts of the world the science is interested in investigating. Physical sciences, like chemistry, physics, and geology, are interested in physical things and the processes that affect them. Social sciences are interested in human societies and the relationships among individuals within those societies. Kotak adds the term humanistic science to this scheme to emphasize anthropology's overlap with the humanities, but you're unlikely to see that term outside his own texts. Most scholars would consider anthropology to be a social science, with a few aspects overlapping with the physical sciences. Another distinction can also help us to determine what kind of science anthropology is, that between the experimental and observational sciences. The physical-social distinction was based on what the scientists were studying. This distinction is about how they conduct the study. An experimental or laboratory science is one that gathers its information about the world by actually manipulating the world. A chemist, for example, pours red liquids into blue liquids and records what happens. A physicist will build a pendulum and measure how long it takes to swing. You do experimental sciences by conducting experiments. But how would an experimental scientist study cultural evolution over the course of millennia, as some anthropologists do, or study the life cycles of stars? We don't have thousands of years to wait for experimental results, so experimental sciences can't address those sorts of questions. Instead, those domains of study are observational or historical sciences. Instead of manipulating the world to create the conditions that we want to study, an observational scientist finds situations and circumstances that already exist. Anthropology is an observational science. We don't study human culture by stranding strangers on a deserted island and seeing what happens. We go around and observe cultures that already exist, then we compare and contrast what we find, and we try to draw some general conclusions. So let's go back and talk a bit about social sciences specifically. As I said before, a social science is one interested in human societies and relationships among individuals within them. Different social sciences vary in what kinds of relationships they're interested in, or in how they study those relationships. For example, economics is only interested in relationships related to obtaining, distributing, and utilizing resources. History is only interested in those relationships that are recorded in historical documents. Political science is interested in explaining those relationships having to do with power and decision-making. Of all the social sciences, the only one that specifically sets out to study all types of social relationships in any manner necessary is anthropology. Kotak defines anthropology, what he calls general anthropology, as the study of humans around the world and through time. That leaves the exact relationship between anthropology and the humanities unclear, though. Literature, art, and so forth also study humans, but they're not doing anthropology. A better definition of anthropology is the holistic scientific study of all aspects of the human condition. I think the terms holistic and scientific are extremely important in defining the discipline, but ultimately, anthropology is the science that answers the question, who are we? Now clearly, with either definition, anthropology has an awfully ambitious goal, and no anthropologist can hope to really be proficient in all aspects of the human condition. So American anthropology is divided into 4 subdisciplines: physical anthropology, linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and sociocultural anthropology. And within each subdiscipline, there are a variety of even more specific specializations. Physical anthropology is also called biological anthropology. It is the study of human biological variation through time and as it exists today. It could easily be considered a subdiscipline of biology, except that physical anthropology focuses strongly on the biocultural perspective, the idea that both biological and cultural approaches are necessary to fully understand humans. A course taught in the biology department might have a smaller explanatory role for culture. Linguistic anthropology is the study of language and linguistic diversity in time, space, and society. Because language is intimately tied to culture, Linguistics is closely tied to sociocultural anthropology and uses many of the same techniques. Archaeology is the study of human behavior through material remains, and it's usually studying human behavior in the past specifically. Archaeology allows anthropologists to study cultures that are no longer around, unlike sociocultural or linguistic anthropology, which can only study cultures that are still in practice. Archaeology thus accesses a deeper timescale than sociocultural anthropology, and we can study much slower, longer-term processes. In this way, it is similar to biological anthropology and the study of human evolution. Let's go back now to look more closely at sociocultural anthropology. It's the comparative, cross-cultural study of human society and culture, and it usually engages in direct observation of contemporary living societies. These are the folks who go out to live with the natives and learn their ways. Since they're directly observing these societies in action, sociocultural anthropology has a central place in anthropology. Many behaviors and ideas that are not accessible to other anthropologists can be studied by sociocultural anthropologists. If anthropology is about observing humans, this is the most direct and obvious way to make those observations. Sociocultural anthropology can be divided up in a whole host of ways, but one of the most basic is the distinction between ethnography and ethnology. Ethnography is an in-depth description and analysis of a single culture. Ethnology is the comparison and contrast of multiple ethnographies in the hopes of finding general principles operating in all of them. More on this distinction in future lectures. A final, very important distinction in anthropology cross-cuts the subdisciplines. The subdisciplines differ from one another primarily according to which aspects of the human condition they examine. The distinction between academic and applied anthropology lies in what you do with the information that you learn. Academic anthropology is science for science's sake, pure research aimed only at learning more about people. Applied anthropology is the use of that information to solve specific real-world problems. There are applied approaches in each of the subdisciplines. Applied physical anthropology, for example, is most often seen in forensic anthropology, the use of physical anthropology techniques to solve crimes, usually by identifying crime victims and their causes of death. Forensic archaeology is similar, focusing on the material remains around a crime scene. Cultural resource management, another kind of applied archaeology, is aimed at identifying and conserving culturally important remains and using them to enhance the lives of living people. Applied linguistics might be involved in reviving dying languages or in identifying how language use affects children's learning. Applied sociocultural anthropology involves problems like economic development and ecological issues. We'll look at applied sociocultural anthropology in more detail later in the course. So this then is a good place to stop. We have defined both science and anthropology, talked about how our own subdiscipline of sociocultural anthropology fits into each of those categories, and how it differs from all the other members. In our next lecture, we'll shift focus from the philosophy of science to the fundamental theoretical constructs anthropologists use to explain human behavior, culture, and society.